Welcome to segment 2 for Wednesday. We're going to pick up with our look at the changes in culture at the turn of the century, starting with the motion picture industry, which we talked a little bit about before, the idea that initially it was the arcades that you see here in the top right. There's a good example of that. The Nickelodeon, this is a very early version of it, but you can see they made it into a bit more of a dynamic machine that people would use. As we talked about, the movie industry actually grew as entrepreneurs figured out that by showing one movie to many people, they could make much more money than showing a whole bunch of different movies to individuals. And so the movie industry as we know it begins actually in the New York area. The demand for movies increased exponentially. Now these are still silent films, although they'll often have a piano or something like that that plays along. But they're silent films, but of course people came from far and wide and considered it a very important night out to go see a motion picture. And so much so that the demand increased to the point where production in New York was no longer something that actually was feasible, because they needed more movies, and the weather in New York made it difficult, especially if you wanted to do any kind of filming outside. And so a few entrepreneurs picked up what they had and moved out to what at that point, as you see in the picture there in the middle, was an area of desert out in Southern California, just outside of a dusty town called Los Angeles, to what at that point was called the Hollywoodland, as you can see there in that image. And of course the rest, as we know, is history. Now, what's important about the movie industry in a lot of ways in United States history is not just the impact that it has on the view people have of our nation and that we have of ourselves, but the fact that because the industry grew so quickly and was really not overly regulated by the government until much later there was an attempt to regulate it, the United States movie industry was really at the cutting edge of technology and creativity. And so in many ways, because they were so successful, our view of the world coming from the United States was exported to the world. And so a lot of people found that the movies that were available in their country were ones that were made here. So it's really an interesting component to how American culture becomes so important worldwide. It's growing at this point as we're looking at, but of course it gets more important. And then down in the right corner you see the first major motion picture to really be shown across the United States, which was D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, and we talked a little bit about it. The movie itself is actually about the entire history of the United States, but of course we focused on the idea that because Griffin was from the South and had a view of Reconstruction that was pretty negative towards the Northern influence there in the attempt to create racial equality, that a lot of people following Reconstruction actually believed that was the correct view. Now, moving on from the things that developed around this time, and we talked a little bit about other things like amusement parks and things along those lines, we now move to the way people viewed life in general and how that changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and industrialization. And so we're going to look at new ways of thinking about life and of thinking about what we do as individuals. And we start with something called Reform Darwinism. And this is really to deal with the question that everybody seemed to be perplexed by, which is all the change that we're seeing actually something that's good? Reform Darwinism seemed to say yes. Change is good, and evolution proves this. So social Darwinism, we talked about before, the idea that we understood, or at least that at that point in history they understood, that there were few people at the top and the masses at the bottom, and that's just the way things were intended almost, that God meant it to be that way. Just as in nature, the strong survive and the weak fall to the wayside through evolution. Well, this notion of Darwinism was then turned a little bit to begin to try and answer the question, is all this change we're seeing something good? And those who supported the changes that were taking place said, of course it is. Evolution proves that change is good. So it's an answer to what's going on around them. Now, they didn't think that up before they began the change, but in a sense it's a way of justifying the things that are going on. So if that's the case, then what kind of change should we actually focus on or demand or try to help create? And that's the answer to that is something called pragmatism. And pragmatism is, as you see here, the idea that we will choose actions based on the results they bring, not just because they have been done that way in the past. And this was really an answer by the people who thought a lot of the change was good to those who said that the change was bad and that we were doing terrible things and that our culture was going down the drain. Pragmatism becomes such an ingrained part of our culture that a lot of people today don't even realize what it is, and when you try to describe it to them, they don't really know why it is you're even talking about it, because it seems to be something that we embrace so fully that we don't realize that we're actually doing it. But the point of pragmatism is that you cut through all the formality and all of the ways things were done in the past, including in morality and all kinds of other areas, and just do things because of the result that they bring. And so pragmatism, as well as Reformed Darwinism, helped to shape the mindset of the people who lived through the changes in the turn of the century. Moving us to progressivism. And of course this is going to be a form of change, and really it's time now to clean up the Gilded Age, and so that's where we're headed. It takes place from 1890 to 1914. Notice that a lot of things seem to end in 1914, and that's because the nation becomes almost solely focused on World War I, and it definitely is a very important milestone in American history. But it's time to clean up the Gilded Age, and in a sense it's a form of populism, which is, remember, the outcrying and the complaints and the movement that was created by the people in rural areas who believed that they were being mistreated and ripped off by the system. But now we're going to see that when people in the cities begin to understand how badly they are being treated, they will demand change, and unlike the farmers or the rural voters, they have the numbers to make the change actually occur. So we're going to see all kinds of things like you see in the images here. It'll be the end of child labor at least in factories. The attempt, and successful in many cases, to go after the robber barons. And of course, as you see over there on the right, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, causing the United States government to get involved in regulating the food industry. So let's take a look at progressivism. Why does it happen at this point? Well, one of the things that drives it is the fear of the monopolies that were created by people like John D. Rockefeller and others. Of course, we talked about why monopolies are bad, because they can charge whatever they want to. Monopolies or trust explode with rapid business consolidation that takes place from 1897 to 1904, so that, in a sense, many of the industries in the United States are controlled by just a small group of people. But probably more important in progressivism occurring is the dependence that city dwellers now had on others helping them. A lot of American culture that had developed up to that point had been very much based on the individualism and the rugged individualism of living on the farm or living in a rural area and taking care of yourself. But now that people were in cities, and for instance they could no longer watch their own food grow in the ground, they had to depend on others to provide it for them, and so they must trust other people in order to survive. Now, the American people, as it says, of course, were almost genetically inclined to fear government. But what happens during progressivism is that they not only ask for government to come in and help them against all the problems they're facing, in fact, they actually demand the government's help. So here's the short version of how it happens. Interestingly, the whole thing seems to be sparked by, or the beginnings of progressivism can definitely be traced to, of course, populism before, but the beginnings of this progressivism can be traced to the fact that businesses began to support common education in order to get smarter workers. We call it public education today, and so workers are taught to read. Now, as we talked about in class the other day, the media adjusts to these new consumers and begins to change what they put in the papers, and of course advertisers now want to market to larger audiences because of the mass consumption that occurs as a result of mass production driving prices down. And so the people who are now newly capable of reading will buy the products advertised in newspapers. And as it says here, ironically, progressivism is actually, or at least the beginnings of it, is driven by profit. So we'll see how ironic that is as we move forward. Books, magazines, and papers hit upon the idea of muckraking as the type of story that seems to interest the American people the most. Now, muckraking, a term that, as we'll talk about, was coined by Teddy Roosevelt, is the idea that reporters began to do what we now call today investigative reporting, and that means that they would go into things that most people didn't know much about or didn't really know what were happening, and expose them to the American public and demand that something be done about them. You can take Upton Sinclair's book The Jungle, which interestingly he didn't write for the purpose of truly being a muckraking novel, but it turned out that way. But in that book he exposed a lot of the practices that were taking place in the meatpacking industry, and a result of that being brought out caused people to demand that something be done. Roosevelt called it muckraking because it seemed as if these newspaper reporters and magazine writers were raking the muck of the culture, and he compared it to what you have to do in a horse stall after it's stayed in the stall for a long time, and you must rake out the muck. So that's the comment that he's actually making. The first magazine to really hit on this and actually increase its circulation dramatically as people began to buy the magazine to read these stories was McClure's magazine, and once they were successful, many other magazines and newspapers followed in their step. These stories increased the public's fear of monopolies because it describes how these monopolies behave and the terrible conditions that were involved and how they are stealing from the people and how they are really making the lives of the average American pretty bad. And so these stories increased their fear of monopolies, and the American people began to demand to see this be stopped. Interestingly, as they demand that the businesses be regulated, or at least be governed in some way by the government does not initially respond, and this goes back to the corruption that we saw before. So, if change was going to occur, and people are fired up by reading the magazines and newspaper articles, they're going to have to change government. So government must be cleaned up first before business can be reined in. Politicians who then pick up on this and champion progressive causes become very popular. People jump on the bandwagon of saying we must regulate businesses and we must change them. They're urged on by newspapers and magazines that continue to profit during this crusade, which again is the ironic part of it, is that they're cleaning up America, but they're making a good living themselves by writing about all of this. So what we end up having in progressivism is the idea that the American people themselves begin to believe that they can change their system. It becomes an extension of the Puritan influence, the perfectionist doctrine of the 1830s, the idea that we could have a perfect culture, the Puritan influence, the idea that we must control the things around us, and the crusade of the old abolitionists, some of whom are the progressives. And it allows them to continue those crusades, and it spreads quickly to other areas of society, as we'll see. The key component, as we said, were the muckrakers. This is a cartoon that shows Teddy Roosevelt kind of illustrating where he came up with the name for muckrakers. Some people called them the yellow journalist of graft and corruption. Now, they didn't have to really expand on things too much to prove how bad the situation really was, but they were not beyond making up stuff and exaggerating in order to get their point across. You see there the McClure's magazine, and they were talking about the bosses of the labor unions and how they were corrupt in that particular case. One of the first things that's attacked is the power of the political party, and that's kind of interesting because of what's going on in today's current election. But one of the things that people noticed was that the politicians were very much controlled by their parties, and so the parties must change their corrupt ways for any reform to occur. So the first major flurry of progressive reforms were aimed at political parties, and so the politicians who jumped on the bandwagon here began to say, yes, let's regulate the parties, and so we saw a couple of immediate changes that had huge impacts: the Australian ballot and the direct primary system. The common theme we'll see in these, and most of the things that go on in, especially in the political side of progressivism, is that the people get more direct influence on the system. Before it had been run by an elite, the people get more power. The Australian ballot is the idea of the secret ballot. It was first tried in Australia. Voting up to that point in time in American history was done out in the open. I think we talked about it the other day, that If you voted for one candidate, you'd put a piece of paper in one box, and another candidate put a piece of paper in another box, and everybody knew who you were voting for. This went back to the old days when people would actually stand up when they voted for a particular candidate. That was called stand-up voting. And we'll pick up with more of this as we move to episode 3.